This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 11 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. How they are to conduct themselves who have entered the obscure night. During the aridity of the night of sense, when God effects the change of which I have spoken, when he leads the soul out of the way of sense into that of the spirit, from meditation to contemplation, where it is helpless so far as its own powers are concerned, spiritual persons have to endure great afflictions, not so much because they are in the state of aridity, but because they are afraid that they have missed the way, thinking that they are spiritually ruined, and that God has forsaken them, only because they find no support or consolation in holy things. Under these circumstances, they weary themselves and strive, as they were wont, to fix the powers of the soul with some satisfaction upon some object of meditation. They think when they cannot do this, and are not conscious of their labor, that they are doing nothing, but with great dislike and interior unwillingness on the part of the soul, which enjoys its state of quietness and rest. While they change from one condition, they make no progress in the other, because by exerting their own spirit, they lose that spirit which they had in tranquillity and peace. They are like a man who does his work over again, or who goes out of a city that he may enter it once more, or who lets go what he has caught in hunting that he may hunt it again. Their labors are in vain, for they will find nothing, and that because they are turning back to their former habits. Under these circumstances, if they meet with no one who understands their case, these persons fall away and abandon the right road, or become weak, or at least put hindrances in the way of their further advancement, because they make efforts to proceed in their former way of meditation, fatiguing their natural powers beyond measure. They think that their state is the result of negligence or of sin. All their efforts are now in vain, because God is leading them by another and a very difficult road, that of contemplation. Their first road was that of discursive reflection, but no imagination or reasoning can reach the second. It behooves those who find themselves in this condition to take courage and persevere in patience, but put their confidence in God, who never forsakes those who seek him with a pure and upright heart. Neither will he withhold from them all that is necessary for them on this road until he brings them to the clear and pure light of love, which he will show them in that other obscure night of the Spirit, if they shall merit an entrance into it. The conduct to be observed by spiritual men in the night of sense is this: let them in no wise have recourse to meditations, for the time is now past, and let them leave their soul in quietness and repose, though they may think they are doing nothing, that they are losing time, and that their tepidity is the reason of their unwillingness to employ their thoughts. They will do enough if they keep patience, and persevere in prayer. All they have to do is to keep their soul free, unembarrassed, and at rest from all thoughts and all knowledge, not anxious about what they shall think or meditate, contenting themselves with directing their attention lovingly and calmly towards God, and all this without anxiety or effort, or immoderate desire to feel and taste his presence. For all such efforts disquiet the soul, and distract it from the calm repose and sweet tranquillity of contemplation belonging to their present state. And though they may have many scruples that they are wasting time, and that it may be better for them to betake themselves to some other occupation, seeing that in prayer and meditation they are becoming helpless, yet let them be patient with themselves, and remain quiet, for what they are uneasy about is their own satisfaction and liberty of spirit. If they were now to exert their interior faculties, they would only impede and ruin the good which, in that repose, God is working in the soul. For if a man, while sitting for his portrait, cannot be still, but moves about, the painter will never depict his face, and even what he may have done will be spoiled. So when the soul interiorly reposes, every action and passion, or anxious consideration at that time, will distract and disturb it, and make it feel the dryness and emptiness of sense. The more efforts it makes to acquire support in affection and knowledge, the more it will feel the deficiency which cannot now be supplied in that way. It is therefore expedient for the soul which is in this condition not to be troubled because its faculties have become useless. Yea, rather it should desire that they may become so quickly. For by offering no impediment to the operation of infused contemplation, to which God is now admitting it, the soul is refreshed in peaceful abundance, and set on fire with the spirit of love, which this obscure and secret contemplation induces and establishes within it. Still, I do not mean to lay down a general rule for the cessation from meditation. That should occur when meditation is no longer feasible, and only then, when our Lord, either in the way of purgation or affliction, or of the most perfect contemplation, shall make it impossible. At other times, and on other occasions, this support must be had recourse to, namely, meditation on the life and passion of Christ, which is the best means of purification and of patience and of security on the road, and an admirable aid to the highest contemplation. Contemplation is nothing else but the secret, pacific, and loving infusion of God, which, if it be admitted, will set the soul on fire with the spirit of love, as I shall show in the explanation of the following verse. Section 12 of the Obscure Night of the Soul, by St. John of the Cross, with anxious love inflamed. The burning fire of love, in general, is not felt at first, for it has not begun to burn, either because of our natural want of purity, or because the soul, not understanding its own state, has not given it a peaceful rest within itself. Sometimes, however, whether that be the case or not, a certain anxiety about God arises, and the more it grows, the more the soul feels itself touched and inflamed with the love of God, without knowing how or whence that feeling arises, except that at times this burning so inflames that it longs earnestly after God. David in this night said of himself, "My heart hath been inflamed, and my reins have been changed, and I am brought to nothing, and I knew not." That is, my heart hath been inflamed in the love of contemplation. My reins, that is, my tastes and affections also, have been changed from the sensitive to the spiritual way by this holy dryness, and in my cessation from them all. And I am brought to nothing, and I knew not. The soul, as I have just said, not knowing the way it goeth, sees itself brought to nothing as to all things of heaven and earth, wherein it delighted before, and on fire with love, not knowing how. And because occasionally this fire of love grows in the spirit greatly, the longings of the soul for God are so deep that the very bones seem to dry up in that thirst, the bodily health to wither, the natural warmth and energies to perish in the intensity of that thirst of love. The soul feels it to be a living thirst. Such also was the feeling of David when he said, "My soul hath thirsted after the strong living God." It is as if he had said, "My thirst is a strong living thirst." We may say of this thirst that being a living thirst, it kills. Though this thirst is not continuously, but only occasionally, violent, nevertheless it is always felt in some degree. I commenced by observing that this love, in general, is not felt at first, but only the aridity and emptiness of which I am speaking. And then, instead of love, which is afterwards enkindled, what the soul feels amidst its aridities and the emptiness of its faculties is a general painful anxiety about God, and a certain misgiving that it is not serving Him. But a soul anxious and afflicted for His sake is a sacrifice pleasing unto God. Secret contemplation keeps the soul in this state of anxiety, until, in the course of time, having purged the sensitive nature of man, in some degree, of its natural forces and affections by means of the aridities it occasions, it shall have kindled within it this divine love. But in the meantime, like a sick man in the hands of his physician, all it has to do, in the obscure night and dry purgation of the desire, is to suffer, healing its many imperfections and practicing many virtues, that it may become meet for this divine love, of which I speak while explaining the following line. O happy lot! When God establishes the soul in the obscure night, that he may purify, prepare, and subdue its inferior state, and unite it to the Spirit, by depriving it of light, and causing it to cease from meditation, as he afterwards establishes it also in the spiritual night, that he may purify the spirit, and prepare it for union with God, the soul acquires such great advantages, though it seems not so, that it looks upon it as a great happiness to have escaped from the bondage of the senses in that happy night, and therefore it sings, O happy lot! It is necessary now for us to point out the benefits which accrue to the soul in this night, and for the sake of which it pronounces itself happy in having passed through it. All these benefits are comprised in these words, Forth unobserved I went. This going forth of the soul is to be understood of that subjection to sense under which it labored when it was seeking after God in weak, limited, and fitful ways, for such are the ways of man's sensitive nature. It then fell at every step into 1,000 imperfections and ignorances, as I showed while speaking of the 7 capital sins, from all of which the spiritual man is delivered in the obscure night which quenches all desire in all things whatsoever, and deprives him of all his lights in meditation, and brings with it other innumerable blessings towards the acquirement of virtue. It will be a great joy and comfort to him who travels on this road to observe how that which seems so rugged and harsh, so contrary to spiritual sweetness, works in him so great a good. This good flows from going forth, as to all affections and operations of the soul, from all created things, in this obscure night, and journeying towards those which are eternal, which is a great happiness and a great good. In the first place, because the desires are extinguished in all things, and in the second place, because they are few who persevere and enter in at the narrow gate, by the strait way that leadeth to life. How narrow is the gate, and strait is the way that leadeth to life, and few there are that find it. The narrow gate is the night of sense. The soul detaches itself from sense that it may enter into that night, directing itself by faith, which is stranger to all sense, that it may afterwards travel along the straight road of the other night of the Spirit, by which it advances toward God in most pure faith, which is the means of the divine union. This road, because so straight, dark, and terrible, for there is no comparison between its trials and darkness and those of the night of sense, is travelled by very few, but its blessings are so much the more. I proceed now to speak with the utmost brevity of the blessings of the night of sense, that I may pass on to the other. Section 13 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, of the benefits of the night of sense. This night and purgation of the appetite is full of happiness to the soul, involving grand benefits, though it seems as if all were lost. As Abraham made a great feast on the day of Isaac's weaning, so there is joy in heaven when God takes a soul out of its swaddling clothes, when he takes his arms from under it and makes it walk alone, and he denies it the milk of the breast and the delicate food of children, and gives it bread with the crust to eat. When he makes it eat the bread of the strong, which is presented in the aridities and darkness of sense, to the spirit emptied and dried of all sensible sweetness, namely the bread of infused contemplation. This is the first and principal benefit, from which almost all the others flow. Of these, the first is a knowledge of our own selves and our own vileness. For over and above that this knowledge ordinarily includes those favors which God bestows on the soul, these aridities and emptiness of the faculties as to their former abounding, and the difficulty which good works present, bring the soul to a knowledge of its own vileness and misery, which in the season of prosperity it saw not. This truth is vividly shadowed forth in the book of Exodus. There we read that God, willing to humble the people and bring them to a knowledge of themselves, commanded them to lay aside their ornaments and festival attire, which they ordinarily wore in the wilderness, saying, "Lay aside thy ornaments," that is, lay aside thy holiday garments, and put on thy common vestments, that thou mayest know what treatment thou hast deserved. It is as if he said to the people, "Inasmuch as the ornaments you wear, being those of joy and festivity, are the cause why you think not meanly of yourselves, you really are mean, lay them aside, so that henceforth, clad in vile garments, you may acknowledge that you deserve nothing better, and also who and what you are." Here the soul learns the reality of its own misery, which before it knew not. For in the day of its festivity, when it found great sweetness, comfort, and help in God, it was highly satisfied and pleased, thinking that it rendered some service to God. For though it may not explicitly say so, yet, on account of the satisfaction it feels, some such feeling still clings to it. But when it has put on the garments of heaviness, of aridity, and abandonment, when its previous lights have become darkness, it will then possess in reality that excellent and necessary virtue of self-knowledge, counting itself for nothing, and having no satisfaction in itself, because it sees that of itself it does and can do nothing. This diminished satisfaction with self, and the affliction it feels because it thinks that it is not serving God, God esteems more highly than all its former delights and all its good works, however great they may have been. For then many imperfections and ignorances clung to it. But now in the garb of aridity it derives not only those fruits of which I am speaking, but others also of which I shall presently speak, much more than I can speak of, as from proper source and font of self-knowledge. In the next place, the soul learns to commune with God with more reverence and gentleness, and this is always necessary when it converses with the Most High. Now in its prosperous days of sweetness and consolation, the soul was less observant of reverence, for the favors, of which it was then the object, rendered the appetite somewhat bold with God, and less reverential than it should have been. Thus it was with Moses when he heard the voice of God. For carried away by the delight he felt, he ventured, without further consideration, to draw near, till God commanded him to stop, saying, "Come not nigh hither. Put off the shoes from thy feet." This teaches us how reverently and discreetly, in spiritual detachment, we are to converse with God. When Moses had become obedient to the voice, he remained so reverent and considerate that not only did he refrain from advancing, but, in the words of the Scripture, durst not look at God. For having put off the shoes of desire and sweetness, he recognized profoundly his own meanness in the sight of God, for such a state of mind became him, when about to listen to the divine words. The temper of mind to which Job was brought, in order that he might converse with God, was not of that delight and grandeur, such as he had before. God left him in misery, naked on a dunghill, persecuted by his friends, filled with sorrow and grief, covered with worms. Then it was that the Most High, who lifteth up the poor out of the dunghill, was pleased to communicate himself to Job in greater abundance and sweetness. revealing to him the deep mysteries of his wisdom, as he had never done before in the days of Job's prosperity. And now that I am on this subject, I must here point out another great benefit of the obscure night and aridity of the sensitive appetite. It is this: God, verifying the words of the prophet, "Then my light shall rise up in darkness," enlightens the soul, so that it shall confess not only its own misery and meanness, but also His grandeur and majesty. Not only does the extinction of desires and the suppression of sensible joy and consolation purify the intellect for reception of the truth, for sensible joys and desires even of spiritual things obscure and perplex the mind, but the trials and aridities of sense also enlighten and quicken the intellect. As it is written, "Vexation alone shall make you understand what you hear." Vexation shall make us understand how God in His divine wisdom proceeds to instruct a soul, emptied and cleansed, for such it must be before it can be the recipient of the divine influences, in a supernatural way, in the obscure and arid night of contemplation, which He could not do before, when it was given up to its former sweetness and joys. The prophet sets this truth before us with great clearness, saying, "Whom shall He teach knowledge? And whom shall He make to understand the teaching? Them that are weaned from the milk, that are drawn away from the breasts." The temper of mind, then, meet for the divine influence, is not so much the milk of spiritual sweetness, nor the breasts of sweet reflections in the sensitive powers, such as the soul once enjoyed, as the absence of both, the one and the other. And therefore, if we would listen to the voice of the great King with due reverence, the soul must stand upright, and not lean on the affections of sense for support. We must be like the prophet, who said of himself, "I will stand upon my watch, and fix my foot upon the tower, and I will watch to see what will be said to me." To stand upon the watch is to cast off all desires. To fix the foot is to cease from all reflections of sense, that we may behold and understand what God will speak to us. Thus out of this obscure night springs first the knowledge of oneself, and on that, as on a foundation, is built up the knowledge of God. "Let me know myself," saith St. Augustine, "and I shall then know Thee, O my God." As philosophers say, one extreme is known by another. In order to show more fully how effectual is the night of sense, in its aridity and desolation, to enlighten the soul more and more, I produce the words of the psalmist, which so clearly describe the power of this night in bringing men to the knowledge of God. In a desert land, and where there is no way and no water, so in the sanctuary have I come before Thee, to see Thy power and Thy glory. The psalmist does not say, and it is worthy of observation, that his previous sweetness and delight were any dispositions meet for the knowledge of the glory of God, but rather that aridity and weaning from the sensitive faculties, which are here meant by the barren land. Neither does he say that his reflections and meditations on divine things, with which he was once familiar, had led him to the knowledge and contemplation of God's power, but rather his inability to meditate on God, to form reflections by the help of his imagination, which he describes by a land where there is no way. The means, therefore, of attaining to the knowledge of God and of ourselves is the obscure night with all its aridities and emptiness, though not in the fullness of the other night of the Spirit, for this knowledge is, as it were, the beginning of the other. Amid the aridities and emptiness of this night of the desires, the soul acquires also spiritual humility, which is the virtue opposed to the first capital sin, spiritual pride. The humility acquired by self-knowledge purifies the soul from all imperfections into which we fell in the day of our prosperity. For now, seeing ourselves so dried up and miserable, it does not enter into our thoughts, even for a moment, to consider ourselves better than others, or that we have outstripped them on the spiritual road as we did before. On the contrary, we acknowledge that others are better than we are. Out of this grows the love of our neighbors, for we now esteem them, and no longer judge as we used to do, when we looked upon ourselves as exceedingly fervent, and upon others as not. Now we see nothing but our own misery, which we keep so constantly before our eyes that we can look upon nothing else. This state is admirably described by David himself in this obscure night, saying, "I was dumb, and was humbled, and kept silence from good things, and my sorrow was renewed." All the good of his soul seemed to him so mean that he could not prevail upon himself to speak of it, and he was silent as to the good of others, because of the pain he felt in the knowledge of his own wretchedness. In this state, too, men are submissive and obedient in the spiritual way, for when we see our own wretchedness, they not only listen to instruction, but desire to have it from anyone who will guide them their steps, and tell them what they ought to do. That presumption which sometimes attended them in their prosperity is now gone. And finally, all those imperfections are swept clean away, to which I referred when I was treating of spiritual pride. Section 14 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Other benefits of the Night of Sense. The imperfections of spiritual avarice, under the influence of which the soul coveted all spiritual goods, was never satisfied in the practices of devotion, because of its eagerness for the sweetness it found therein, become now, in this arid and obscure night, sufficiently corrected. For when the spiritual man finds no more sweetness and delight, as he was wont to do, in spiritual things, but rather bitterness and vexation, he has recourse to them with such moderation that he loses now, perhaps through defect, what he lost before through excess. Though, in general, to those who are come to this night, God gives humility and readiness, but without sweetness, in order that they may obey him solely through love. Thus they detach themselves from many things, because they find no more sweetness in them. The soul is purified also from those impurities of spiritual luxury of which I have spoken before, in this aridity and loathing of the senses which it now finds in spiritual things. For those impurities proceed, in general, from the sweetness which flowed occasionally from the spirit into the sense. The imperfections of spiritual gluttony, from which the soul is delivered in the obscure night, have been discussed in a former chapter, though not all, because they cannot be numbered. I shall not enumerate them here, for I wish to conclude the subject of this night, that I may pass on to the other, with regard to which I have serious things to write. Suffice it then to say that the soul, in addition to the benefits already mentioned, gains, in this night, innumerable others in its resistance to spiritual gluttony. It is set free from those imperfections there enumerated, and from many other evils greater than those described, into which too many fall, as we learn by experience, because they have not corrected their desires in the matter of spiritual gluttony. For when God, in this arid and obscure night, so curbs the desire and bridles concupiscence that the soul can scarcely feed it all upon the sensible sweetness of heavenly or earthly things, and this so continuously that the soul corrects, mortifies, and controls its concupiscence and desires, so that the very forces of its passions seem to be broken down, marvelous benefits flow forth from that spiritual temperance, in addition to those I have mentioned. For, through mortifying concupiscence and the desires, the soul dwells in spiritual tranquillity and peace, because, where concupiscence and desire have no sway, there is no trouble, but, rather, the peace and consolations of God. Another benefit is this, a perpetual recollection of God, with fear lest we should be going back on the spiritual way. This is a great benefit, and not the least, of aridity in the purgation of the appetite, for the soul is cleansed thereby from those imperfections which disfigured it through the affections and desires, the effect of which is to obscure and deaden the soul. Another great benefit of this night is the practice of many virtues at once, such as patience and long-suffering, which are well tried in these aridities, when men persevere in their spiritual exercises without sweetness or comfort. The love of God is practiced, because men are no longer attracted by sweetness and consolation, but by God only. The virtue of fortitude is also practiced, because amid the hardships, the absence of sweetness, which the soul now endures, it gathers strength from weakness, and so becomes strong. Finally, all the virtues, cardinal, theological, and moral, are practiced amidst these aridities. David tells us from his own experience that the soul gains these 4 benefits in this obscure night, namely, delight of peace, constant recollection of God, pureness of soul, and the practice of all virtues. My soul, saith he, refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was delighted, and was exercised, and my spirit swooned away. He adds also, I meditated in the night with my own heart, and I was exercised, and I swept my spirit clean of all affections. The soul is purified also in this aridity of the desires from the imperfections of envy, anger, and sloth, and acquires the opposite virtues. Softened and humbled by these aridities, by the hardships, temptations, and afflictions which in this night try it, it becomes gentle with God, with itself, and with its neighbors. It is no longer impatiently angry with itself because of its own faults, nor with its neighbors for theirs. Neither does it avoid with a kind of dislike the things of God, nor utter unseemly complaints because he does not perfect his work at once. As to envy, the soul is now charitably disposed towards everyone, and if any remain, it is no longer vicious as before, when the soul was afflicted at the preference shown to others, or at their greater progress. For now it yields to everyone, considering its own misery, and the envy it feels, if it feels any, is a virtuous envy, a desire to emulate them, which is a great virtue. The sloth and weariness now felt in spiritual things are no longer vicious as they were once. They were once the fruit of spiritual delights which the soul experienced at times, and sought after when it had them not. But this present weariness proceeds not from the failure of sweetness, for God has taken it all away in this purgation of the appetite. Other innumerable benefits flow from this arid contemplation. For in the midst of these aridities and hardships, God communicates to the soul, when it least expects it, spiritual sweetness, most pure love, and spiritual knowledge of the most exalted kind, of greater worth and profit than any of which it had previous experience, though at first the soul may not think so, for the spiritual influence now communicated is most delicate and imperceptible by sense. Finally, inasmuch as the soul is purified of all affections and sensitive desires, it attains to liberty of spirit, wherein it acquires the 12 fruits of the Holy Ghost. It is also delivered in a most wonderful way from the hands of its 3 enemies, the devil, the world, and the flesh. For when all sensible delight and sweetness are quenched, the devil, the world, and the flesh have no weapons wherewith to assail it. These aridities, then, make the soul love God in all pureness, for now its operations depend no longer upon the pleasure and sweetness which it found in its works, as perhaps was the case when that sweetness was present, but only in the desire it has to please God. The soul is not now presumptuous and self-satisfied, as perhaps it may have been in the day of its prosperity, but timid and diffident of self, deriving no satisfaction whatever from self-contemplation. Herein consists that holy fear by which virtues are preserved and grow. This aridity quenches concupiscence, and subdues our natural spirits. For now, when God infuses from time to time His own sweetness into the soul, It would be strange if it found by any efforts of its own any comfort or sweetness in any spiritual act or practice. The fear of God and anxiety for His service increase in this arid night, for as the beasts of sensuality, which nourished and sustained the desires that clung to them, become dry, nothing remains in that aridity and detachment but an anxious desire to serve Him, which is most pleasing unto God, as it is written, "A sacrifice to God is an afflicted spirit." When the soul beholds the many and great benefits which have fallen to its lot in this arid purgation through which it passed, it cries out with truth, "O happy lot, forth unobserved I went." I escaped from the bondage and thraldom of my sensitive desires and affections unobserved, so that none of my three enemies were able to hinder me. These enemies of the soul so bind and imprison it, that it cannot go forth out of itself to the liberty of the perfect love of God, by the help of its tastes and desires, without which they can do nothing against it. And therefore, when the four passions of the soul, joy and grief, hope and fear, are subdued by persevering mortifications, when the natural sensitive appetite is lulled by continual aridities, when the concert of the senses is silent, and when the interior powers have ceased from discursive reflections, this is the household of man's lower nature, these enemies cannot hinder the spiritual liberty of the soul, and the house thereof remains tranquil and at rest. Section 15 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. My house being now at rest. When the house of sensuality was at rest, that is, when the passions were mortified, concupiscence quenched, the desires subdued and lulled to sleep in the blessed night of sensitive purgation, the soul began to set out on the way of the Spirit, the way of proficience, which is also called the illuminative way, or the way of infused contemplation, wherein God Himself nourishes and refreshes the soul without the help of any active efforts that itself may make. Such, as I have said, is this night and purgation of the senses. But this night, in their case, who are to enter into that more awful night of the Spirit, that they may go forwards to the divine union of the love of God, it is not everyone but only a few who do so in general, is attended with heavy trials and temptations of sense of long continuance, but in some longer than in others. For to some is sent the angel of Satan, the spirit of impurity, to buffet them with horrible and violent temptations of the flesh, to afflict their minds with filthy thoughts, and their imaginations with representations of sin most vividly depicted, which at times becomes an affliction more grievous than death. This night is also occasionally attended by the spirit of blasphemy. The thoughts and conceptions are overrun with intolerable blasphemies, and, at times, suggested to the imagination with such violence as almost to break forth in words. This, too, is a heavy affliction. Again, another spirit, called by the prophet the spirit of giddiness, is sent to torment them. This spirit so obscures their judgment that they are filled with 1,000 scruples and perplexities. They can never satisfy themselves about them, nor submit their judgment therein to the counsel and direction of others. This is one of the most grievous stings and horrors of this night, most like to that which passes in the night of the Spirit. God ordinarily sends these violent storms and temptations in the night of sensitive purgation upon those whom He is about to lead afterwards into the other night, though all do not enter in, that being thus chastened and buffeted, they may prove themselves, dispose and habituate sense and faculties for the union of the divine wisdom to which they are to be then admitted. For if the soul be not tempted, exercised, and tried in temptations and afflictions, the senses thereof will never attain to wisdom. What doth he know, asks the wise man, that hath not been tried? He that hath no experience knoweth little. He that hath not been tried, what manner of things doth he know? Jeremias also bears witness to the same truth, saying, Thou hast chastised me, and I was instructed. The most proper form of this chastening, for him who will apply himself unto wisdom, are those inferior trials of which I am now speaking. They are the most effectual for purging the sensitive nature from all sweetness and consolations, to which, by reason of our natural infirmities, we are addicted, and most capable of really humbling the soul, that it may be prepared for its coming exaltation. But how long the soul will continue in this fast and penance of sense, no one can with certainty tell. It is not the same in all men, neither are all men subjected to the same temptations. These trials are measured by the divine will, and are proportioned to the imperfections, many or few, which are to be purged away, and also to the degree of union in love to which God intends to elevate a particular soul. That is the measure of its humiliations, both in their intensity and duration. Those who are endowed with the capacity for suffering, and those who have force sufficient to endure, are purified in more intense trials and in less time. But those who are weak are purified very slowly, with weak temptations, and the night of their purgation is long. Their senses are refreshed from time to time, lest they should fall away. These, however, come late to the pureness of their perfection in this life, and some of them never. These persons are not clearly in the purgative night, nor clearly out of it, for though they make no onward progress, yet in order that they may be humble and know themselves, God tries them for a season in aridities and temptations, and visits them with His consolations at intervals, lest they should become faint-hearted, and seek for comfort in the ways of the world. From other souls, still weaker, God, as it were, hides Himself, that He may try them in His love, for without this hiding of His face from them, they would never learn how to approach Him. But those souls that are to go forwards to so blessed and exalted a state as this in the union of love, however quickly God may lead them, tarry long in general, amidst aridities, as we shall see by experience. Having now brought the first book to a close, I proceed to treat of the second night. Section 16 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. The second night, that of the Spirit, when it begins. The soul, which God is leading onwards, enters not into the union of love at once, when it has passed through the aridities and trials of the first purgation and the night of sense. It must spend some time, perhaps years, after quitting the state of beginners, in exercising itself in the state of proficients. In this state, like a man released from a rigorous imprisonment, it occupies itself in divine things with much greater freedom and satisfaction, and its joy is more abundant and interior than it ever experienced in the beginning, before it entered the sensitive night. Its imagination and faculties being no longer tied down, as hitherto, to spiritual thoughts and reflections, it now rises at once to most tranquil and loving contemplation, and finds spiritual sweetness without the fatigue of meditation. But as the purgation of the soul is still somewhat incomplete, the chief part, the purgation of the spirit, being wanting, without which, by reason of the mutual connection between our higher and lower nature, man being an individual, the purgation of sense, however violent it may have been, is not finished and perfect. It will never be without some aridities, darkness, and trials, sometimes much more severe than in the past, which are, as it were, signs and heralds of the coming night of spirit, though not so lasting as that night. For when the days or the season of this tempestuous night have passed, the soul recovers at once its wonted serenity. It is in this way that God purifies some souls whom He does not raise to so high a degree of love as others. He admits them at intervals into the night of contemplation or spiritual purgation, causing the sun to shine upon them occasionally, and then to hide its face, according to the words of the psalmist. He sendeth His crystal, that is, contemplation, like morsels. These morsels of obscure contemplation are, however, never so intense as is that awful night of contemplation of which I am speaking, and into which God purposely leads the soul, that he may elevate it to the divine union. That sweetness and interior delight, which the proficients find so easily and so plentifully, come now in greater abundance than before, overflowing into the senses more than they were wont to do previous to the sensitive purgation. And as the senses are now more pure, they can taste of the sweetness of the Spirit in their way with greater facility. But since the sensitive part of the soul is weak, without any capacity for the strong things of the Spirit, they who are in the state of proficience are liable, by reason of the spiritual communications which reach to the sensitive part, to great infirmities and sufferings, and physical derangements, and consequently weariness of mind, as it is written, "The corruptible body presseth down the mind." Hence the communications made to these cannot be very strong, intense, or spiritual, such as they are required to be for the divine union with God, because of the weakness and corruption of the sensitive part, which has a share in them. Here are the source of ecstasies, raptures, and dislocation of the bones, which always happen whenever these communications are not purely spiritual, that is, granted to the mind alone, as in the case of the perfect, already purified in the second night of the Spirit. In them these raptures and physical sufferings have no place, for they enjoy liberty of spirit with unclouded and unsuspended senses. To make it clear how necessary it is for proficients to enter into the night of the Spirit, I will now proceed to point out certain imperfections and dangers to which they are liable. Section 17, of the Obscure Night of the Soul, by St. John of the Cross, of certain imperfections of proficients. Proficients labor under two kinds of imperfections, one habitual, the other actual. The habitual imperfections are their affections and imperfect habits which still remain, like roots in the mind, where the purgation of sense could not penetrate. The difference between the purgation of them and the others is like the difference between plucking out a root and tearing off a branch, or like removing a fresh and an old stain. For, as I have said, the purgation of sense is merely the gate and entrance of contemplation, and serves rather to harmonize sense and spirit than to unite the latter with God. The stains of the old man still remain in the mind, though not visible, and if they be not removed by the strong soap and lye of the purgation of this night, the mind cannot attain to the pureness of the divine union. They suffer also from a certain dullness of mind, and a natural rudeness which every man contracts by sin, a distraction and dissipation of mind, which must be refined, enlightened, and made recollected in the sufferings and hardships of this night. All those who have not advanced beyond the state of proficience are subject to these habitual imperfections, which cannot coexist with the perfect state of union with God in love. But all are not subject to actual imperfections in the same way. Some, whose spiritual goods are so much on the surface, and so much under the influence of sense, fall into certain improprieties and dangers, of which I spoke in the beginning. For as they admit into their minds and senses so many communications, so that they have frequent imaginary and spiritual visions, for this happens together with other spiritual impressions to many of them in this state, wherein the devil and their own proper fancy delude the soul, and as Satan is wont with so much sweetness to insinuate and impress such things upon them, they are easily deluded and influenced by him, because they do not take the precaution to resign themselves into the hands of God, and defend themselves with all their might against these visions and impressions. For now the devil causes them both to believe in vain visions and false prophecies, and to presume that God and his saints are speaking to them. They also frequently believe in their own fancies. Now, too, Satan fills them with pride and presumption,
Under the influence of vanity and arrogance, they make a show of themselves in the performance of exterior acts which have an appearance of sanctity, such as ecstasies and other phenomena. They become bold with God, losing holy fear, which is the key and guard of all virtue. Many of them become so entangled in manifold delusions, and so inveterate have their falsehoods grown, that their restoration to the pure road of virtue and real spirituality is exceedingly doubtful. They fall into this miserable condition because, too confident in themselves, they gave way to these spiritual apprehensions and impressions when they began to advance on the road of spirituality. I have much to say of these imperfections, and how much more incurable they are than the others, because they are considered as more spiritual than those which preceded them. But I shall pass on. One thing, however, I must say, to show how necessary for the further advancement of the soul the spiritual night is, that there is no one proficient, however great may be his exertions, who can be free from many of these natural affections and imperfect habits, the purification of which must, as I have said, necessarily precede the divine union. Besides, and I have said it before, inasmuch as the spiritual communications reach also to a lower part of the soul, they cannot be as intense, pure, and strong, as it is necessary they should be for the purpose of the divine union. And, therefore, if that is to be attained, the soul must enter the second night of the spirit where, perfectly detaching sense and spirit from all sweetness and from all these apprehensions, these communications will guide it on the road of obscure and pure faith, the proper and adequate means of union, as it is written, I will espouse thee to me in faith. That is, I will unite myself to thee in faith. Section 18 of the Obscure Night of the Soul, by St. John of the Cross. Proficients, then, have had experience of these sweet communications, in order that the sensitive part of the soul, allured and attracted by the spiritual sweetness overflowing into the senses, may be harmonized and united with the spiritual part, both parts having to eat of the same spiritual food, each in its own way, off the same dish of their one individuality, that they might be prepared, united, and conformed for the sufferings of the sharp and rough purgation of the spirit which is before them. In that purgation, two parts of the soul, the spiritual and the sensitive, are to be wholly purified, for neither of them can be perfectly purified without the other, and the purgation of sense is then effectual when that of the spirit commences in earnest. Hence it follows that the night of sense may and should be called a certain reformation and bridling of the appetite rather than purgation, because all the imperfections and disorders of the sensitive part, having their strength and roots in the mind, can never be wholly purged away until the evil habits, rebelliousness, and perverseness of the mind are corrected. Therefore, in this night ensuing, both the parts of the soul are purified together. This is the end for which it was necessary to have passed through the reformation of the first night, and to have attained to that tranquillity which is its fruit, in order that, united together in spirit, they may both be purified and suffer together with the greater courage, most necessary for so violent and sharp a purgation. For if the weakness of the inferior part be not redressed, and if it have acquired no courage in God, in the sweet communions with Him subsequently enjoyed, nature would have given way, unprepared for the trials of this night. The intercourse of proficients with God is still most mean, because the gold of the Spirit is not purified or refined. They think and speak of Him as children, and their feelings are those of children, as described by the Apostle. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. Because they have not yet reached perfection, which is union with God in love. But in the state of perfection, having grown to manhood, they do great things in spirit, all their actions and all their faculties being now rather divine than human, as I shall hereafter explain. For God is stripping them of the old man, and putting on the new, as it is written, Put on the new man, who is created according to God. And again, be reformed in the newness of your mind. He now denudes the faculties, the affections and feelings, spiritual and sensitive, interior and exterior, leaving the intellect obscure, the will dry, the memory empty, the affections of the soul in profoundest affliction, bitterness, and distress, withholding from the soul the former sweetness it had in spiritual things, that this privation may be one of the principles of which the mind has need, in order that the spiritual form of the Spirit, which is the union of love, may enter into it and be one with it. All this our Lord effects in the soul by means of this pure and obscure contemplation, as it is described in the first stanza. True, I have explained that in the beginning of my work on the night of sense, yet its chief signification belongs to this second night of the Spirit, because that is the chief part of the purification of the soul. I shall, therefore, apply it in this sense, and explain it here again. Section 19 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. In an obscure night, with anxious love inflamed, O happy lot! Forth unobserved I went, my house being now at rest. Taking these words, then, with reference to purgation, contemplation, or detachment, or poverty of spirit, these are, as it were, one and the same thing. They may be thus explained. In poverty, unsupported by any apprehensions, in the obscurity of the intellect, in the conflict of the will, in the affliction and distress of memory, lost in the obscurity in pure faith, which is the obscure night of all the natural faculties, the will alone touched by grief and affliction, by the anxieties of my love of God, I went forth out of myself. I went forth out of myself, out of my low conceptions and lukewarm love, out of my scanty and poor sense of God, without being hindered by the flesh or the devil. This was to me a great blessing, a happy lot, for by annihilating and subduing my faculties, passions, and affections, the instruments of my low conceptions of God, I went forth on the scanty intercourse and operations of my own to those of God. That is, my intellect went forth out of itself, and from human became divine. For united to God in that purgation, it understands no more within its former limits and narrow bounds, but in the divine wisdom to which it is united. My will went forth out of itself, transformed into the divine will, for now, united with the divine love, it loves no more with its former scanty powers and circumscribed capacity, but with the energy and pureness of the divine Spirit. Thus the will acts no more in the things of God in a human way, and the memory also is transformed into the eternal apprehensions of glory. Finally, all the energies and affections of the soul are, in this night in purgation of the old man, renewed into a divine temper and delight.
Section 20 of the Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Obscure contemplation is not a night only, but pain and torment also for the soul. In an obscure night. This obscure night is a certain inflowing of God into the soul, which cleanses it of its ignorance and imperfections, habitual, natural, and spiritual. Contemplatives call it infused contemplation, or mystical theology, whereby God secretly teaches the soul and instructs it in the perfection of love, without efforts on its own part, beyond loving attention to God, listening to His voice and admitting the light He sends, without understanding how this is infused contemplation. It is the loving wisdom of God that produces special effects in the soul, for it prepares, by enlightening it for union with God in love, that loving wisdom, which by enlightening purifies the blessed spirits, is that which here purifies and enlightens the soul. But it may be said, why do we call the divine light,
which enlightens the soul and purges it of its ignorances, the obscure night? I reply, that the divine wisdom is, for two reasons, not night and darkness only, but pain and torment also to the soul. The first is, the divine wisdom is so high that it transcends the capacity of the soul, and therefore is, in that respect, darkness. The second reason is based on the meanness and impurity of the soul, and in that respect the divine wisdom is painful to it, afflictive, and obscure also. To prove the truth of the first reason, we assume a principle of philosophy, namely, the more clear and self-evident divine things are, the more obscure and hidden they are to the soul naturally. Thus, the more clear the light, the more does it blind the eyes of the owl, and the stronger the sun's rays, the greater the darkness of our visual organs. For the sun, in its own strength shining, overcomes them by reason of their weakness, and deprives them of the power of seeing. So when the divine light of contemplation shines into the soul, not yet perfectly enlightened, it causes spiritual darkness, because it not only surpasses its strength, but because it obscures it and deprives it of its natural perceptions. It is for this reason that St. Dionysius and other mystic theologians call infused contemplation a ray of darkness, that is, for the unenlightened and unpurified soul, because the great supernatural light of contemplation overcomes the forces of the natural intellect and deprives it of its natural way of understanding. David also hath said the same thing: clouds and darkness are round about him. Not that this is so in reality, but in reference to our weak understanding, which, in light so great, becomes obscure and blind, unable to ascend so high. And in another place the same truth is declared: at the brightness that was before him, the clouds passed between him and our understanding. This is the reason why the illuminating ray of hidden wisdom, when God sends it from himself into the soul not yet transformed, produces obscure darkness in the intellect. This obscure contemplation is, in its beginnings, painful also to the soul. For as the infused divine contemplation contains many excellences in the highest degree, and the soul, which is the recipient, because not yet pure, is involved in many miseries, the result is, as two contraries cannot coexist in the same subject, that the soul must suffer and be in pain, being the subject in which the two contraries meet, and resist each other because of the purgation of the soul from its imperfections, which is being effected by contemplation. I shall show this to be the case by the following induction. In the first place, because the light and wisdom of contemplation is most pure and clear, and because the soul, within which it shines, is impure and dark, that soul which is the recipient must greatly suffer. Eyes afflicted by humours suffer pain when the clear light shines upon them, and the pain of the soul, by reasons of its impurity, is immense when the divine light shines upon it. And when the rays of this pure light strike upon the soul, in order to expel its impurities, the soul perceives itself to be so unclean and miserable that it seems as if God had set himself against it, and itself were set against God. So grievous and painful is this feeling, for the soul feels as if God had abandoned it, that it was one of the heaviest afflictions of Job when he was in his trial. Why hast thou set me opposite to thee, and I become burdensome to myself? The soul sees distinctly in this clear and pure light, though obscurely, its own impurity, and acknowledges its own unworthiness before God and all creatures. And what pains it still more is the fear it has that it will never cease to be unworthy, and that all its goodness is gone. This is the fruit of that profound depression under which the mind labours in the knowledge and sense of its own wickedness and misery. For now the divine and obscure light reveals to it all its wretchedness, and it sees clearly that of itself it can never be otherwise. To the same effect are the following words of the psalmist: for iniquities thou hast chastised man, and thou hast made his soul pine away as a spider. In the second place, the pain of the soul has its sources in its natural and spiritual weakness. For when the divine contemplation flows within it with a certain vehemence, in order to strengthen it and subdue it, it is then so pained in its weakness as almost to faint away, particularly at those times when the divine contemplation seizes upon it with a greater degree of vehemence. For sense and spirit, as if bowed down by a heavy and dark burden, suffer and groan in agony so great that death itself would be a relief. This was the experience of Job when he cried, I will not that he contend with me with much strength, nor that he oppress me with the weight of his greatness. The soul bowed down by the burden of oppression feels itself so removed out of God's favour that it thinks, and it is so in truth, that all things which consoled it formerly have utterly failed it, and that no one is left to pity it. Job, in like circumstances, has said, Have pity upon me, have pity upon me, at least you, my friends, because the hand of the Lord hath touched me. Wonderful and piteous sight! So great are the weakness and impurity of the soul, that the hand of God, so soft and so gentle, is felt to be so heavy and oppressive, though neither pressing nor resting upon it, but merely touching it, and that too in mercy. For he touches the soul not to chastise it, but to lead it to his graces.